Mulberry Street, Manhattan. September 13th, 1922. The evening heat still hangs in the air. A man in a pressed jacket turns the corner, straw boater hat tilted just so, the way men wore them all summer. He doesn't hear them coming. 6 figures step out of the doorway. The hat flies. Boots find it before it hits the ground. He reaches for it. A fist finds his jaw first. When he looks up from the cobblestones, bleeding, and goes to the police, they tell him he had it coming. He was wearing a straw hat after September 15th. And that, apparently, was all the justification anyone needed. To understand what happened on September 13th, 1922, you need to understand a rule that was never written in any law, never voted on by any legislature, never enforced by any court, and yet was obeyed by millions of American men for over 30 years. The rule was simple. Straw hats were summer wear, and summer ended on September 15th. Not September 16th, not October 1st, September 15th, on the dot. Wearing a straw boater after that date didn't just mark you as unfashionable, it marked you as someone who didn't know the rules, someone who didn't belong. The straw boater itself, called a skimmer, was the dominant men's hat of the 1910s and early 1920s. It cost between $1 and $3, roughly $17 to $50 in today's money. Every working man owned one. And every working man knew. When September 15th arrived, the boater went into the closet. The rule dated to the 1890s, born from Victorian-era codes that governed everything from dinner etiquette to which glove you removed first when greeting a lady. But this rule had teeth that the others didn't, because breaking this one had consequences. The tradition of knocking hats from men's heads after September 15th had existed since at least 1910. The New York Tribune documented incidents going back years. Young boys snatching boaters off commuters and running, crowds laughing, the man shaking his fist at a retreating back. It was considered mischief, a rite of autumn. Newspapers treated it the way they treated snowball fights, charming, if slightly annoying. But 1922 was different. The gangs that assembled in September 1922 were not boys playing pranks. They were organized. They moved in coordinated sweeps through entire neighborhoods. Some were teenagers, yes, some as young as 15, but they moved with tactical precision, blocking escape routes, targeting clusters of men, working block by block like they'd planned it. And crucially, they were willing to hurt people who resisted. In 1910, if you held onto your hat, the boy moved on. In 1922, if you held onto your hat, you ended up on the ground. Something had shifted in the 12 years between those incidents, and historians are still not entirely sure what. What we do know is that by the night of September 13th, 1922, the tradition had become something else entirely. Mulberry Bend. The evening of September 13th, 48 hours before the September 15th deadline. The gangs don't wait for the rule to technically apply. They strike early, and they strike hard. Roving bands of young men sweep the Lower East Side in coordinated waves. The targets are easy to spot. Any man still wearing a straw boater in the September heat. Most surrender their hats immediately, raising their hands, letting the mob stomp the skimmer into the pavement. But Mike Murphy doesn't surrender. Murphy is a dock worker from the Hester Street district, a man who loads cargo for a living, who has strong hands and a stronger pride. When the gang reaches for his hat, he pushes back. What follows is not a scuffle. It is a beating. When it's over, Mike Murphy is on the pavement of Hester Street, bleeding, requiring transport to a hospital for his injuries. His crime, wearing a straw hat 2 days before the unofficial deadline. By midnight, dozens of men across the Lower East Side have lost their hats. Several have lost more than that. And the night is only beginning. Mike Murphy goes to the police. He has injuries. He has witnesses. He has a straightforward case of assault. The officer hears him out. And then, according to reporters who were present at the precinct that night, the officer tells him something extraordinary. He tells Murphy that he was wearing a straw hat after the season, that he had, in effect, brought this upon himself. The police made almost no arrests on the night of September 13th despite receiving dozens of complaints. Multiple officers acknowledged the social convention to reporters as if it explained everything. One patrolman, asked why the gangs weren't being dispersed, reportedly shrugged and said the hat wearers knew what time of year it was. Think about what that means. Law enforcement in one of the most powerful cities on Earth had so completely internalized an unwritten fashion rule that they were using it to justify assault. The social code had overwritten the legal code. The rioters weren't breaking the peace. In the eyes of authority, the men in straw hats were. And with the police stepping aside, there was nothing stopping what came next. September 14th, one day before the deadline, the riots spread. What began in the Lower East Side overnight has metastasized across the island. By morning, gangs are operating in Midtown. By afternoon, they reach the transit infrastructure of the city itself. At the Day Street station of the Hudson Tubes, the subway line connecting Manhattan to New Jersey, a mob intercepts a crowd of commuters making their way home from work. The station descends into chaos. Platform fights block access to the trains. For more than an hour, hundreds of passengers are effectively trapped, unable to board, unable to leave, while the hat hunting continues on the platform above. Traffic across Lower Manhattan grinds to a halt as brawls spill into intersections. Newspaper reporters racing to the scenes find new incidents beginning before they can even document the old ones. The New York Times will run 3 separate dispatches that evening. What had started as a neighborhood disturbance was now a coordinated siege of one of the world's most important cities. And September 15th, the actual deadline, hadn't even arrived yet. September 15th, the deadline day itself. By now the men of New York's waterfront districts have had enough. Dock workers and factory hands returning from their shifts on East 8th Street walk directly into a hat-knocking gang. These are not office clerks or merchants who can absorb a punch and walk away. These are men who load cargo in all weather, who handle machinery, who are accustomed to physical confrontation. When the gang reaches for their hats, they don't step back. They step forward. The brawl that erupts on East 8th Street is serious enough that mounted police are called in. The first time in 3 days that law enforcement makes a genuine effort to intervene. Horses push through the crowd. Officers swing clubs. The fighters scatter down side streets and into tenement doorways. Blood is drawn on both sides. Several men are taken into custody. And for a moment, just a moment, it seems like the city is finally going to reassert order. But what happens next reveals that order, in September 1922, is a more complicated concept than anyone wants to admit. When the police finally made arrests on September 15th, something remarkable emerged from the records. The men being charged were not only the hat attackers. Several of the men who had physically fought back against the gangs, who had defended themselves from assault, were themselves arrested and charged with disorderly conduct. Meanwhile, documented hat destroyers in multiple incidents were released with warnings or not charged at all. The legal system had inverted. The act of wearing a straw hat on September 15th had become, in practice, a legal provocation. The act of defending yourself from mob violence against that hat had become, in practice, the crime. New York court records from September 1922 document this pattern clearly. Men with bloody faces and witness statements stood in front of magistrates facing charges. The gangs that put them there walked. Most people who learn about the Straw Hat Riots assume the story is absurd, a quirky historical footnote about fashion. What the court records show is something far more disturbing. An institutional machine that had organized itself entirely around the enforcement of a rule that nobody had ever voted on, nobody had ever written down, and nobody could legally justify. And that machine was still running. By the time the riots wound down after 3 days, police had made more than 40 arrests across Manhattan. Most defendants faced disorderly conduct charges, a misdemeanor carrying a maximum penalty of $50 or 10 days in jail. $50 for 3 days of citywide mob violence. The New York Times editorial board issued a condemnation, but buried within it was a telling acknowledgement. The paper recognized the September 15th hat rule as a genuine tradition stretching back at least 30 years, and suggested the real problem was not the rule itself, but the excess of its enforcement. That framing is extraordinary. The leading newspaper in America was essentially arguing that beating a man bloody for wearing the wrong hat was a matter of degree, not principle. The story spread to national papers within days. The wire services carried it to every major American city. And across the country, the reaction was not uniform horror. Many readers nodded along. A significant portion of the public, by the evidence of letters to editors and op-eds published that week, agreed that hat etiquette was serious, that the September 15th rule was legitimate, and that the men who violated it bore some responsibility for what followed. The rioters had not acted alone. They had acted for an audience that approved. And then the story reached Washington. Senator James Reed of Pennsylvania rose on the floor of the United States Senate in September 1922 and addressed the Straw Hat Riots directly. His speech entered the congressional record. He called the events in Manhattan evidence of, and these are his words, mob rule replacing personal liberty. Reed was not a soft man or a reflexive progressive. He was a conservative Democrat who had opposed the League of Nations. His condemnation of the riots was not political theater, it was genuine alarm. Because what the senator understood, watching from Washington, was that the Straw Hat Riots were not really about hats. They were a demonstration of something deeply unsettling about the American social contract, that ordinary citizens, under the right conditions, will enthusiastically use physical violence to enforce compliance with rules that have no legal basis whatsoever. The government hadn't created this enforcement apparatus. No law had authorized it. The people had built it themselves, from nothing but shared expectation and the ancient human need to punish those who step outside the line. A senator was asking the right question, but history has a way of burying the right questions. Social psychologists have a name for what drove the Straw Hat Riots, though the term wouldn't be formalized until decades later. It is called norm enforcement, the mechanism by which groups police deviance from shared expectations. The rioters were not, by their own self-understanding, criminals. They were enforcers, guardians of a consensus. And here is the crucial, deeply uncomfortable insight. When the consensus is strong enough, when the shared expectation is internalized widely enough, violence against those who violate it stops feeling like crime. It starts feeling like justice. The police officers who dismissed Mike Murphy's complaint weren't corrupt in any conventional sense. They had simply absorbed the social code so completely that they couldn't see the assault beneath it. The magistrates who charged the defenders were not malicious. They were operating within a framework that had assigned moral weight to an unwritten rule and legal weight to its violation. This is the machinery that built the Straw Hat Riots. Not malice, not criminality, consensus. And the most frightening aspect of consensus-driven violence is that you cannot see it from inside. The people enforcing the rule never think of themselves as the mob. They think of themselves as the reasonable ones. The Straw Hat Riots do not exist in isolation in American history. They sit at the beginning of a long and uncomfortable lineage of norm enforcement violence. Events where the target of attack was defined not by race or religion or politics, but simply by visible deviation from an expected social presentation. Sundown towns used social expectation as the architecture of terror. Dress code violence recurred throughout the 20th century. School conformity attacks were documented in every decade. What makes 1922 uniquely useful as a case study is precisely the triviality of the trigger. Because the straw hat carries no ideological weight. Nobody has a political theory about the straw hat. Nobody has a religious justification for the straw hat. Strip away all the rationalizations that usually surround norm enforcement violence, and what you're left with in 1922 is the naked mechanism itself, the pure human impulse to punish visible deviation, operating in a context where nobody can pretend it's about anything more profound than a piece of woven grass on a man's head. And yet the violence was real. The injuries were real. The institutional complicity was real. The mechanism doesn't require a profound cause. It only requires consensus. The Straw Hat Riots of 1922 did not produce a reckoning. No law was passed. No commission was convened. No officer was disciplined for dismissing assault victims. The 40-plus men arrested mostly paid their $50 fines or served their 10 days and returned to their lives. The September 15th hat tradition continued in quieter forms for several more years. Boys still knocked hats. Crowds still jeered. But the organized mob violence of 1922 was never repeated at the same scale. The reason it faded had nothing to do with any improvement in civic virtue or social wisdom. It faded because the straw boater hat itself faded. Through the mid-1920s, the fedora rose to dominance in American men's fashion. By 1930, the boater was already a relic, associated with barbershop quartets and vaudeville rather than everyday wear. When the hat disappeared, the rule that governed it disappeared with it. Not because anyone had examined the rule and found it wanting. simply because there was no longer anything to enforce it against. The machinery went dormant. It did not dismantle. The Straw Hat Riots of 1922 are absent from most American history curricula. When they appear at all, it's as a footnote, a curiosity, good for a paragraph in a book about Prohibition-era oddities. And that absence is itself the point. We don't teach the Straw Hat Riots because they are embarrassing, not to the rioters, but to us. They reveal something we would rather not examine. That ordinary people, acting in ordinary social contexts, with no malicious ideology and no criminal organization, will physically harm other ordinary people for the crime of visible nonconformity. The hat changed. The instinct never did. Somewhere right now, someone is having their hat knocked off, not with fists, perhaps, but with the modern equivalents, the pile-on, the public shaming, the coordinated assault of consensus on the individual who stepped outside the line. The machinery is the same, only the hat is different. If this story unsettled you, good. Subscribe to History's Hidden Chapters, where the past doesn't stay buried. And drop a comment. What's the straw hat rule that nobody has questioned yet?